This is On Shifting Ground. I'm Ray Suarez. 2 years since it invaded, Russia refuses to cede control over captured Ukrainian land, and America's indecisiveness around renewed military assistance for Ukraine may give Vladimir Putin an opening to seize even more ground. If you listen to some Republican politicians, or perhaps Tucker Carlson, Putin is already on his way to victory. Ukrainians are prepared to fight as long as it takes, but a new saying has taken hold in the war-torn country: none of us is coming back from this war. And when the normalcy of wartime seeps in, larger ideals like democracy take a back seat. If not for the war, President Zelensky's turn at the ballot box would have come in March 2024. How long can Ukraine remain in this state of limbo? And how will the war effort impact Ukraine's democratic project? Joining me to answer these questions is Masha Gessen. They're an award-winning author and staff writer for The New Yorker, and Gessen has recently earned a spot on the Kremlin's wanted list. Masha, welcome to On Shifting Ground.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
You remind us in your recent New Yorker piece that this is, in many ways, not the second anniversary of the Russian-Ukrainian war, but more like the 10th. Maybe we can start by having you set the scene in Kyiv with what came to be known as the Revolution of Dignity. What was that?
So this happened a bit more than 10 years ago, in November 2013. Ukraine was on track to sign an association agreement with the European Union, which would have strengthened economic ties, and Putin was very upset by this, parachuted into Ukraine, exerted a lot of pressure on the already pro-Russian Ukrainian leadership at the time, promised Ukraine $15 billion in aid, basically bought Ukraine, and the Ukrainian president at the time, Viktor Yanukovych, backed out of the agreement. Ukrainians took to the streets, some of them because they were very pro-European, some of them because they were upset with the president for caving into Russia, even if they didn't have any particular interest in joining Europe. And some of them because they're upset with the president for going back on a democratically accomplished agreement, even if they didn't have any interest in Europe. So it actually brought together a lot of Ukrainian political forces in a really extraordinary revolution that lasted for 3 months and ended with the abdication of Yanukovych, his escape to Russia, a new election, and really a renewed Ukrainian democratic project, and also with Russia's annexation of Crimea and Russia's fomenting war in eastern Ukraine.
Did a Ukraine emerge from the tumult of the Maidan, the fleeing of Yanukovych, the election of a variety of successors that was more democratic, more functioning like a country that was looking westward to Europe?
Absolutely. This was the third Ukrainian revolution since the Soviet Union started falling apart. And each revolution was a giant step toward democratization. That's really something that makes Ukrainian history extraordinary. With every passing political crisis, Ukraine turned more toward a democratic project, a commitment to greater enfranchisement, a commitment to trying to figure out how to run a post-Soviet country in a way that fosters representation. And every time it's a renewed belief in a better future.
Do you think in February 2022, Vladimir Putin would have basically agreed with your assessment that Ukraine was, if he didn't do something drastic, slipping out of Russia's grasp?
Ukraine had long ago slipped out of Russia's grasp. And I think it's tricky to ascribe the kind of motivation to Putin when he invaded Ukraine that is directly related to what was happening in Ukraine. A lot of what was happening in Putin's imagination. He had built up this whole narrative, which we heard him reiterate again in his interview to Tucker Carlson recently, about Ukraine never having been a real country, being a so-called artificial nation. All of these imperialist and basically fascist tropes. And there's a way in which Ukraine is the anti-Russia. Ukraine is a country that has really shown that its past doesn't determine its future, that a country can emerge from Soviet totalitarianism with a future orientation. And that makes its case unusual in that part of the world and unnerving for Putin, who doesn't believe that Ukraine exists, who doesn't believe that there is a separate Ukrainian political culture or separate Ukrainian language, for God's sake, and imagines that it's Russia's sort of doppelganger, which terrifies him.
Given the stasis on the battlefield during a rough winter, there are all kinds of reports that would lead you in one direction or another. Reports about worries about wider conscription inside Ukraine, about Zelensky shaking up the military, inconclusive battles in the east, despair and dread under constant Russian bombardment in some of these cities, the reports of the sinking of yet another important ship in Russia's Black Sea Fleet. So sometimes you go up, sometimes you go down. Can Ukraine hold on, given the situation that you see today as someone who's been watching this closely?
I'm not a military expert, but what I do know about wars is that wars are unpredictable. You can't look at a battlefield and predict how it's going to turn out, even if you have the numbers, even if you have complete information. So here's what we do know. We know that the Ukrainian counteroffensive did not succeed in the way that Ukrainians hoped and supporters of Ukraine hoped. And it seems NATO was counting on the Ukrainian counteroffensive succeeding. We know that Ukraine is facing an extreme crisis of manpower. There just aren't enough people to continue fighting. People who volunteered in the first days of the war, unless they have become ineligible for military service because of severe injury or other circumstances, have not been released. These are people who have been serving for almost 2 years. Ukraine is working on a plan to conscript Ukrainians living outside Ukraine, showing just how desperate this manpower shortage is. That's what we know. We also know that, yes, Ukraine continues to make significant incursions that have a psychological impact on Russians. Ukraine shelled the Russian city of Belgrade yet again, causing a significant number of casualties. Also, Ukraine has eliminated yet another Russian warship. That's a huge symbolic victory for Ukraine. But what I'm in a better position to talk about is the social and psychological state of Ukraine. And in a sense, that's more predictable.
To be clear, when I use the term hold on, I think there's a political dimension to that and an emotional dimension to that, quite apart from what's happening on the battlefield. If you are far from the front, but still have to run into your basement when the air raid sirens sound, after 2 years, that has a corrosive effect, let's say. The feeling that might have accompanied the first couple of months of brave resistance may be eroding a little bit.
That's exactly right. War no longer feels like an emergency, feels like a way of life. And when you say if you're far from the front, Ukraine is a very large country, but very few people are really far from the front. The front line is 1,000 miles long, and that's the active front line. There's only a very tiny part of Ukraine that has never been shelled. Most of Ukraine is, at least some of the time, targeted by Russian missiles and easily reachable by Russian missiles. So people in Kyiv, which is relatively far from the active front line, they spent a fairly calm fall with very little shelling and an extremely stressful winter with almost daily or almost nightly shelling. Air raid sirens sound all over Ukraine all the time, and people are feeling like they're settling into this forever, as in for the rest of their lives. One politician told me people are saying that they can't subject their kids to this, but schools are functioning. Every school has a bomb shelter. And that phrase was such an incredible reflection of just how normalized this has become. So they don't see themselves as leaving Ukraine, but they see themselves as living the rest of their lives in a situation of war.
For all this undaunted resistance, for all this bravery in the face of sometimes intolerable circumstances, who's getting exhausted first? Some of Ukraine's friends outside Ukraine. Does that undermine what the Ukrainian people and what Volodymyr Zelensky are trying to pull off here?
We are used to talking about this war as having created an unprecedented Western consensus, and Americans have generally boasted about the extraordinary amount of aid they have given to Ukraine. But let me put this bluntly. NATO in general, the United States in particular, has always had the military power to end this war. The amount of aid that they have supplied to Ukraine has been sufficient to help Ukraine hold a more or less steady front line, which leaves 20% of Ukraine occupied by Russia. The essential message of the way that this aid has been constructed is it's okay as long as only Ukrainians are dying. And even that amount of aid has now been at risk. The supplies, the munitions that the United States has promised has not fully been delivered, and that's aid that's already been approved. And the most recent tranche of aid to Ukraine has had the most difficult time making it through Congress. It has been stalled since September. The Senate has finally voted on an aid bill, but it's not clear what its fate is going to be in Congress. And Ukrainians are saying that they have enough munitions to last them through March. That's next month.
You talk about the pride that many Americans take in the aid that's already been delivered to Ukraine, and that's doubtless true. You only have to listen to a Joe Biden speech. But at the same time, there's an emerging wing of American politics willing to confidently extol Russia's chances. They're still a little risk-averse about extolling Russia itself, while denigrating Ukraine as a corrupt, anti-democratic state. What are you watching happen here? You're a Cold War kid like me.
You know, Ray, I'm just so horrified. Every couple of years, a Russian polling organization conducts a poll asking Russians to name the greatest leaders in history. And over the last quarter century, which is the Putin era, it's become more and more clear that with every passing year, Russians believe that greatness is naked aggression, that is the ability to dominate. The great leaders on their list are Stalin, Napoleon, Hitler, and they will say things like, well, yeah, Hitler was horrible, but great. And that's what I see in the admiration that we're seeing among MAGA Republicans for Putin's possible victory in Ukraine. It's this fascination with naked aggression, with the world's bully.
What did you make of the Tucker Carlson interview with Putin?
I can't imagine that many Americans made it past the first 15, 20 minutes because Putin is nothing if not deathly boring. It's like having to go to rewind because you spaced out or fell asleep is the experience I've often had, but I had to watch the whole thing in both languages because one of the interesting parts of the experience was watching the differences between what Putin said in Russian and what the Kremlin's translators supplied for the US audience. There were some significant differences. I'd say two takeaways from the interview. One is that Putin thinks that in Tucker Carlson, he is speaking to a future Trump administration. And the other is that he is talking about Poland obsessively. He mentioned Poland more than 30 times in the course of the interview. And he blamed the start of World War II on Poland. He used the same wording to describe how Poland compelled Hitler to invade Poland, leaving Hitler no choice. The same wording as he has used to describe Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that Ukraine left Putin no choice but to invade. He's positioned Poland as basically a successor to Nazis. How he figures that, I'm not even going to try to delve into that, but he's talking about a country that has just unseated an autocratic government and is trying to restore democracy. That is very much the position that Ukraine was in when Russia first invaded Ukraine 10 years ago. And I think he's telling us that Poland is his next target.
Several frontline states' politicians have been put on various kinds of watch lists and suspect lists and investigation lists, including the Prime Minister of Estonia. And as someone who's on some lists yourself,
Oh, I've been arrested in absentia. I'm not just on lists.
well, so what do you make of this? This is an interesting, at least verbal escalation of the state of play.
It's ridiculous, but it's not funny. Putin is laying the legalistic groundwork for various kinds of future military and non-military aggression. Among other things, he is marking these people as legitimate targets for assassination, which we know is a weapon that Russia uses liberally and has historically used liberally inside and outside of its borders. So it's a direct threat to these people. It's not just empty saber rattling in Moscow.
This cultivation of American assets or American channels of communication have been going on for a long time. What's Putin's game here?
I don't think Putin's game is particularly new or original. This is what Russia and the Soviet Union before it have been doing for decades with short interruptions, which is to try to seduce and cultivate people who are open to seduction and cultivation in the West. What's remarkable about this is that in the 1930s or 1950s and 1970s, people who were open to this kind of seduction were primarily people who were really marginalized in Western countries. Black liberation activists, people who had valid reasons to look at what the Soviet Union was, at least on the surface, which was a country that guaranteed equal rights and provided great financial and social help to populations that in the West would be underserved, and were seduced by this promise of ethnic, racial, and economic equality. The people who are open to seduction now are people of privilege, are white men with a significant amount of political and economic power. That's new in the United States. It doesn't tell us anything new about Russia. Russia is doing what it always did. The fact that its marks have changed, the fact that its message lands with an entirely new population tells us something about the United States and the crisis we're facing here.
Those influential people have talked more about the shortcomings of modern Ukraine than they have about the shortcomings of modern Russia. Volodymyr Zelensky was criticized for postponing elections, which are pretty hard to have when your country's under attack. They have been laser focused on what makes Ukraine less than ideal, and Russia in this whole process seems to get a pass, oddly.
All of that is true. It's also true that Ukraine has problems with corruption. It's also true that Ukraine's democracy is under extreme stress. You can't have democracy in wartime for all sorts of intuitive and not quite intuitive reasons. Even if Ukraine were able to hold elections, what would that even mean? How do you create a government of the governed when millions of your citizens are living outside the country, when millions more are living under occupation? So to blame Ukraine for those problems is the height of hypocrisy. The root cause of Ukraine's democratic problems is Russia. It's Russia's invasion and Russia's unprovoked war of aggression. So to criticize Ukraine for that while embracing an out-and-out totalitarian dictatorship escapes explanation. I feel like you're asking me for something that would shed light on this, but all I can say is, wow.
Well, into that atmosphere comes the alternating messages to rank-and-file Americans who are trying to figure out how they feel about this whole thing. One day they hear that land for peace should be on the table. The next day they hear excerpts from a Putin address that implies that when the smoke clears, Ukraine should not even exist anymore. Then days later, they hear excerpts from a Putin or government statement that says, no, we're ready to talk, and the reason the war is continuing is Ukraine doesn't want to talk to us. I think it's difficult for someone not really following this conflict intensely to figure out whether the United States should continue to send the checks, just how involved this country should be, what the outcome, what the desirable outcome is. I'm willing to cut Americans some slack on this. It can be pretty complicated.
Honestly, I don't think it's that complicated. It's an unprovoked war of aggression. Russia has not been willing to sit down to negotiate. The only messages that Russia has sent out are to the West saying, okay, let's sit down, us and Washington, and decide the future fate of Ukraine. But we also know that Putin lies, that Putin is not a reliable negotiating partner. And we know that whatever negotiated settlement is achieved, which it's extremely unlikely that any settlement would ever be achieved given Russia's attitude toward talks. But if a negotiated ceasefire were to be achieved, it would be temporary. It would only serve the purpose of letting Russia regroup and attack Ukraine again and continue attacking further into Europe. Are Americans willing to countenance that? Are Americans willing to let Russia take part of Ukraine, all of Ukraine, continue to present a military threat to other European countries? Those don't seem to be terribly complicated questions.
And yet I've had conversations with many people who've said to me, well, look, we've got all these problems here. Why are we sending money there? In part because they think the amount of money the United States has committed is a much larger share of our expenditures than it really is. They think there have been exit ramps for both Ukraine and Russia that really don't exist. They're trying to make some decisions in an area of imperfect information. Let's put it that way. I'll give them the benefit of the doubt.
Well, I guess that's our fault, Ray. One thing that even in this conversation I think is probably not coming across well is that the United States hardly sends any money to Ukraine. Military aid to Ukraine stays in the United States. It goes to American defense contractors who get paid for weapons that they've already manufactured, some new munitions and weapons that then go to Ukraine. So this is actually a form of economic aid to the American military-industrial complex. And as far as the lack of exit ramps, that's where Kremlin propaganda has been beating us.
Before we go, I want to ask you about the future. You went back to Russia and spent a significant amount of your adult life and your career there after your family moved to the United States. It was risky. You were exposed to a great deal of hostility, open and covert. Do you think you'll ever be able to go back to Russia?
I don't think so. I went back to Russia in the 1990s. I lived there for 22 years. So that's most of my adult life. The first decade was great. And then things started getting rough. I hadn't given up my Russian citizenship after leaving Russia for the second time 10 years ago because I hoped someday to be able to go back. Not that I necessarily believe that Russia has a better future, but at least a future that I could write about without risk to my life. That's no longer the case now that I'm arrested in absentia in Russia and certain to be convicted, and I'll probably be a convicted felon for the rest of my life, even if there's a change of regime there. I don't think that it'll be their first order of business to review those convictions and clear people.
I want to thank you for taking time to talk with us on Shifting Ground. Always great to talk to you, Masha Gessen. Thanks.
It's great to talk to you, Ray.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced by Sienna Barnes. It was mixed and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spate. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Sport is our executive producer. Philip Yun is co-CEO of Commonwealth Club World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.